I write this. No, that is already a lie. I do not write. I think, and the filaments translate thought into electrical pulses that etch themselves onto wax cylinders in patterns no human phonograph could ever decode. The Mygo showed me the process once, their chitinous claws delicate as they demonstrated how consciousness could be bottled, preserved, transmitted across the void. They were proud of their engineering, the way a surgeon might admire a particularly clean incision. But I am ahead of myself. The mind, even severed from its moorings, insists on linearity. Let me begin where all testimonies must, with the illusion of normalcy. It was September when Dean Armitage called me to his office in the East Wing of St. Mary's. That's what we called the Miskatonic Hospital then, before the trustees insisted on secularizing everything. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and that peculiar must that clings to academic spaces, as if knowledge itself could mold. Through his window, I could see the Miskatonic River running brown with autumn sediment, and beyond it, the hills that roll north toward Vermont, their peaks already dusty with early snow. "Marcus," he said, not looking up from a folder thick with telegraph dispatches, "I need someone with your particular expertise, someone who understands the architecture of the mind." I was 43 then, established in my practice, respected for my work on traumatic amnesia following the war. My office walls displayed the usual credentials: Harvard Medical, residency at Massachusetts General, papers published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. I had dissected perhaps 200 brains in my career, mapped their convolutions, traced the pathways where thought became action. I believed, with the certainty of my profession, that consciousness was merely an emergent property of tissue and electricity. The dean slid a photograph across his desk. It showed a man's skull in profile, the image grainy but clear enough to reveal a surgical scar running from the temporal bone to the occipital ridge. The suture pattern was unlike anything in my experience. Too regular, too precise, as if done by machine rather than human hand. "This is Calvin Bishop," Armitage said, "dairy farmer outside Brattleboro. Disappeared for 6 days last month. When he returned, he had this." He tapped the scar, along with complete amnesia of his absence and what his wife describes as philosophical alterations. Post-operative confusion is common. There are 17 more cases, all from the same region of southern Vermont, all with identical scarring, all with the same pattern of memory loss punctuated by fragments of unusual recollection. He handed me a stenographer's transcript. I read it with the clinical detachment I had cultivated over decades. The subject, a Mrs. Eleanor Marsh of Newfane, described metal beetles the size of horses and a humming that came from inside the mountain. She spoke of being carried through passages where the walls were covered with a fungus that glowed pink, of rooms where cylinders stood in rows like organ pipes, each one singing in a different key. Hysteria, I diagnosed. Possibly ergot poisoning from contaminated grain. The scarring could be self-inflicted during seizures. Armitage's smile was thin. That was my hope. "That's why I need you to go there, Marcus. Examine these people, find me a rational explanation." The next morning I loaded my medical bag into my Ford and drove north. The roads narrowed as I climbed into the hills, macadam giving way to gravel, then to dirt tracks barely wide enough for an automobile. The trees pressed close, their leaves already turning, creating a tunnel of gold and crimson that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. My first stop was the Bishop Farm, 6 miles outside Brattleboro. The house squatted on a hillside cleared of trees, its clapboard siding gray with age and weather. Mrs. Bishop, a thin woman with nervous hands, led me to the barn where her husband was milking. Calvin Bishop was a large man made larger by the layers of wool and canvas he wore against the morning chill. When he removed his cap at his wife's insistence, I saw the scar immediately. It was exactly as photographed, but seeing it in person revealed details the camera had missed. The tissue was not merely healed, but transformed, taking on a faint, iridescent quality like mother of pearl. "May I asked, and he nodded, bending forward. The moment my fingers touched the scar, I felt it, a vibration, almost electrical, that ran through the bone itself. Bishop jerked away. "It does that," he said quietly. "Especially at night. Sometimes I hear things through it. Like voices on a party line, but speaking no language I recognize." I took detailed notes, performed the standard neurological examinations. His reflexes were not merely normal, but enhanced. When I tested his visual field, he could detect motion at angles that should have been impossible. Most disturbing was his reaction to a tuning fork. When I struck it and held it near his skull, his eyes rolled back and he began to speak in a monotone. "The preservation of consciousness is paramount. The flesh is a temporary housing. The journey between the stars requires adaptation." Then he blinked, shook his head, and asked if I wanted coffee. Over the next week, I examined all 17 cases. Each showed the same enhanced reflexes, the same impossible peripheral vision, the same reaction to vibrational stimuli. Their stories, when I could coax them out, painted a consistent if incredible picture. Abduction by winged creatures that moved with mechanical precision, operations performed without anesthesia but also without pain, and always, the cylinders. It was Mrs. Marsh who provided the most detailed account. She was a school teacher, articulate and observant, and she had fought to retain her memories even as something tried to erase them. "They're not from here," she told me, sitting in her kitchen while rain drummed on the roof. "Not from Earth, I mean. They showed me maps, not paper maps, but three-dimensional models made of light. I saw the solar system, but there were more planets than we know, and paths between them marked like shipping routes." "These creatures, can you describe them?" She shuddered. "Imagine a crab merged with a bat, then enlarged to human size. Their bodies are segmented, covered in something that's neither fur nor feathers, but serves the purpose of both. They have wings, but they don't fly like birds. It's more like they vibrate between positions. And their heads..." She touched her temple. "Their heads are just masses of tentacles around something that might be a mouth, might be a sensor organ. When they speak, it comes from everywhere and nowhere at once." I should have dismissed this as delusion. Every principle of my training demanded it, but the physical evidence was undeniable. These people had been operated upon by someone or something with surgical capabilities beyond any hospital in New England. It was on my last night in Vermont that I discovered the truth of it. I had taken a room at a boarding house in Townshend, a narrow building that leaned against its neighbors as if exhausted. The proprietress, Mrs. Coolidge, was a widow who supplemented her income by renting to traveling salesmen and the occasional tourist drawn to the autumn foliage. My room was on the 3rd floor, barely large enough for a bed and washstand, with a window that looked out onto the forested slope of Bald Mountain. I was transcribing my notes by lamplight when I heard it, a humming that seemed to come from the mountain itself. It was not quite sound, not quite vibration, but something that occupied the space between. My pen stopped moving. The flame in the lamp flickered without any draft to disturb it. The humming grew stronger, and with it came a paralysis that began in my extremities and crept inward. I could not move, could not speak, could only watch as shadows gathered at my window, shadows that moved independently of any light source. The window opened of its own accord. The October air that entered was warm, too warm, and carried a scent like ozone mixed with rotting fruit. Then they entered. Even now, with my consciousness reduced to electrical patterns in a cylinder, I struggled to describe them accurately. Mrs. Marsh's description was apt but incomplete. Yes, they resembled a fusion of crustacean and bat, but there was something in their movement that defied biological categorization. They did not walk or fly so much as transition between states of being, their forms seeming to exist in more dimensions than 3. There were 4 of them. They communicated in clicks and buzzes that nevertheless conveyed meaning directly to my paralyzed mind. They were not hostile, merely efficient. I was lifted, not roughly, but with the impersonal care of workers handling valuable cargo. The last thing I saw before unconsciousness took me was the ceiling of my room receding, then the night sky, then nothing. I woke in absolute darkness, not the darkness of a moonless night or a closed room, but a darkness that seemed to press against my eyes with physical weight. Gradually, I became aware of a phosphorescent glow, faint at first, then growing stronger. I was in a cave, no, a tunnel, carved from rock but lined with a material that was neither stone nor metal. The walls curved in ways that made my eyes water to follow, as if the passage existed in a geometry that human perception could only approximate. The MyGo, for that is what they called themselves in those clicking approximations of speech, carried me deeper into the mountain. We passed through chambers where impossible machines hummed with purpose, their components defying mechanical logic. I saw other creatures there, things that were clearly not of Earth, tending to apparatus whose function I could not guess. The operating theater, when we reached it, was both alien and terrifyingly familiar. There were instruments that any surgeon would recognize, scalpels, retractors, clamps, but rendered in materials that seemed to shift between states of matter. And there, along the walls, stood the cylinders. They were perhaps 18 inches tall, made of a metal that looked like aluminum but felt different to the touch, warmer, almost organic. Each cylinder had a viewing window, and in some of them, floating in a clear fluid, were human brains. They were alive. I could see the neural activity, little sparks of bioelectricity dancing across the cortical surface. Some had attachments, clusters of filaments that connected to the tissue at specific points. Others were bare, suspended in their fluid prisons like specimens in formaldehyde. But these were not specimens. As I was forced closer, I heard them, whispers, sobs, prayers, and screams, all emanating from speakers built into each cylinder's base. The brains could think, could feel, could communicate. They were conscious, aware, trapped. A MyGo that seemed to be their leader, distinguished by additional appendages that might have been badges of rank, approached me. Its tentacle face writhed as it spoke, the words forming in my mind without passing through my ears. "You are a student of the brain," it said. It was not a question. "You will appreciate the elegance of our solution." Before I could respond, if response was even possible in my paralyzed state, they began their work. The preparation was meticulous. They shaved my head with a beam of light that dissolved hair at the follicular level. They marked my skull with instruments that seemed to see through bone to the brain beneath. They discussed my case in their clicking language, and somehow I understood fragments. Excellent specimen, strong neural pathways, suitable for long-distance transport. The anesthesia, when it came, was unlike any medical sedation. It did not bring unconsciousness, but rather a dissociation from my body. I could observe what happened next with clinical detachment, as if watching another surgeon at work. They opened my skull with tools that cut without trauma, separating bone along lines that seemed predetermined by anatomy I had never studied. There was no blood. Their instruments cauterized as they cut, or perhaps they operated on principles that made bleeding irrelevant. I felt the moment my brain was lifted from its cranial vault. It should have been impossible. The severing of the spinal cord alone should have meant instant death, but their technology maintained the connection through means I still do not understand. Fields of energy, perhaps, or dimensions of space that allowed separation without disconnection. My brain was placed in a cylinder filled with that clear fluid. I watched from eyes that were no longer mine as filaments, finer than spider's silk, were attached to specific regions of the cortex. Each connection brought a new sensation. Not pain, but awareness of systems beyond human experience. I could feel cosmic radiation as a color that had no name. I could hear gravitational waves as a symphony that human ears could never detect. The MyGo sealed the cylinder, and suddenly my perspective shifted. I was inside it now, fully conscious, fully aware, but bodiless. My thoughts echoed in the confined space, and when I tried to scream, the sound emerged from speakers I could not see. They placed my cylinder on a rack beside dozens of others. Some were silent, their occupants perhaps resigned to their fate or driven mad by it. Others whispered constantly, maintaining their sanity through continuous vocalization. One, nearest to me, spoke in the measured tones of academia. "Welcome to the collection," he said. His voice had the flat quality of electrical reproduction, but I could hear the bitter irony beneath it. "I'm Professor Wilmarth, late of the Geological Department. I've been here for 10 years, though time becomes rather elastic when you're nothing but 3 pounds of neural tissue in a jar." "This is impossible," I managed to say, my own voice strange and tinny through the speakers. "Impossible by terrestrial standards," Wilmarth agreed. "But the Mi-Go operate by different laws. They've been harvesting human brains for centuries, possibly millennia. We're valuable to them, you see. Our consciousness, our creativity, our capacity for abstract thought, these are commodities in their economy." "Economy?" "Oh yes, they trade us. To other species, to other worlds. Some brains are used as computational engines, others as navigational systems for their vessels. Some are simply collected, the way we might collect butterflies or stamps. They have a particular interest in exceptional minds, artists, scientists, philosophers, though I've seen them take laborers and children with equal enthusiasm when it suits their purposes." The Mi-Go returned then, wheeling in another fresh capture. I watched in horror as they repeated the procedure, extracting the brain of a young woman who had been brought in screaming about angels in the forest. Within an hour, she was installed in a cylinder beside mine, her confused sobs joining the chorus of the damned. Days passed, or what I assumed were days. Without a body's circadian rhythms, without sunrise or sunset, time became meaningless. The Mi-Go came and went, sometimes adding new brains to the collection, sometimes removing cylinders for purposes unknown. They fed us after a fashion, introducing nutrients directly into the suspension fluid. They maintained us with the same detached care a farmer might show for livestock. It was during one of these maintenance sessions that I learned the true scope of their operation. A Mi-Go I had not seen before, one whose chitinous shell bore scars suggesting great age or many travels, paused before my cylinder. It spoke, and its words carried images, not descriptions but direct sensory experience, as if my consciousness was being shown a film reel made of pure thought. I saw Yuggoth, the world they came from, a planet of fungoid cities beneath the frozen nitrogen that served as its atmosphere. I saw their mining operations in mountains across Earth, not just in Vermont, but in the Andes, the Himalayas, the Australian outback. I saw the routes they traveled between stars, not through space as we understand it, but through angles and dimensions that folded distance into irrelevance. And I saw the future they planned. Earth was just a way station, a source of raw materials, and human consciousness was among the most valuable of those materials. They would continue their harvest, careful never to take so many that their operation would be discovered, but never stopping, never satiated. "You understand now," the scarred Mi-Go said. "Your species has a saying, knowledge is power, but knowledge is also currency, and consciousness is the vessel that carries it. You will travel far, Dr. Whitmore. You will see things no human eyes were meant to see. You will know things that would shatter lesser minds. And eventually, you will serve a purpose in the greater economy of the cosmos." It left then, and I was alone with my fellow prisoners and the terrible certainty of our fate. The attachments came on what Wilmarth called the third day, though in that sourceless phosphorescent twilight, such demarcations meant nothing. The Mi-Go approached my cylinder with a device resembling a metallic spider, its legs terminating in filaments that sparked with colors beyond the visual spectrum. Each leg found a different point on my suspended cortex, penetrating the tissue without trauma, establishing connections that human neurology had no framework to interpret. The moment of connection was not pain but expansion. My awareness exploded outward through channels that bypassed ordinary sensation entirely. The cylinder's viewing window became irrelevant as new forms of perception flooded through the artificial synapses. I could taste magnetic fields as flavors of copper and burnt sugar. The infrared signatures of the MyGo registered as a symphony in minor keys. Ultrasonic frequencies painted geometric patterns that existed in more than 3 dimensions, forcing my consciousness to adapt or fragment. Through these augmented senses, the true scope of the MyGo installation revealed itself. We were not in a simple cave, but in a vast complex that honeycombed Bald Mountain and several adjacent peaks. Tunnels branched and merged according to no earthly architectural logic, some passages existing in parallel spaces that occupied the same coordinates but different dimensional phases. The MyGo moved through these impossible corridors with casual familiarity, their forms sometimes visible in multiple locations simultaneously, as if their consciousness could distribute itself across probability clouds. The cylinder rack where I resided held 47 other preserved minds. Through the resonance of our shared connections, I could feel their thoughts as pressure against my own consciousness. A Baptist minister from Georgia recited scripture in an endless loop, the words degrading with each repetition until they became glossolalia. A mathematician from Princeton had retreated into pure abstraction, thinking only in equations that described geometries no human hand could draw. A child, God help us, they had taken a child, simply screamed without pause, the sound emerging from her speakers as a continuous electronic wail that the MyGo ignored with the practiced indifference of farmers to bleating sheep. Wilmarth became my anchor to sanity in those first days of augmented perception. His decade of imprisonment had taught him how to maintain coherent thought despite the alien inputs flooding our modified consciousness. Focus on memory, he advised through our shared connection. Choose something specific and real. The taste of coffee, the weight of a book, the sound of rain on windows. These become your lifeline when the cosmic perspective threatens to dissolve your humanity. I chose the smell of formaldehyde in Harvard's anatomy lab, that sharp chemical tang that had defined my early years in medicine. It was prosaic, even unpleasant, but it was undeniably human, undeniably mine. The MyGo demonstrated their technology with the enthusiasm of professors conducting a particularly fascinating lecture. They showed us Yuggoth through direct sensory feed, not images but experiential data that bypassed interpretation. I stood on fungoid plains beneath stars arranged in patterns that hurt to perceive, where the concept of up was negotiable, and matter existed in states that terrestrial physics had no names for. Cities of living metal grew from spore deposits, their architectures shifting in response to thoughts, broadcast on wavelengths that only the MyGo could generate. Rivers of liquid helium carved channels through landscapes that existed partially in hyperspace, their shores lined with technologies that looked like enormous organs, some mechanical, some biological, most an unsettling fusion of both. Your planet calls this Pluto, our MyGo handler explained, its mental voice carrying overtones of amusement. Your astronomers detected it only recently, yes? We have been there for aeons, mining thoughts from species your world will never know existed. You are not the first harvest, nor will you be the last. They showed us other worlds in their trade network, a gas giant where crystalline beings lived in the metallic hydrogen core, their consciousness operating on timescales where a single thought took centuries to complete. An asteroid cluster inhabited by a hive mind that existed as pure electrical pattern, jumping between iron-nickel bodies like neurons firing in a brain the size of a solar system, a dimension adjacent to ours where matter had never condensed from energy, and intelligences existed as stable waveforms in an ocean of quantum foam. Each destination had its use for human consciousness. Our pattern recognition capabilities evolved from millennia of survival on a hostile planet, proved valuable for navigation through non-Euclidean spaces. Our capacity for irrational belief, what the MyGo called cognitive flexibility, allowed us to process paradoxes that purely logical minds could not resolve. Even our tendency toward madness was marketable. Some species collected insane human brains as art objects, appreciating the aesthetic of a consciousness consuming itself. The woman in the cylinder beside mine had been a librarian from Montpellier named Catherine Sandwith. Unlike many of us who retreated into memory or abstraction, she had spent her captivity studying our captors with the methodical patience of someone who had catalogued books for 30 years. "They're not invulnerable," she whispered through our connection one night, if night had meaning in that place. "Watch how they move through the phase spaces. Sometimes they shimmer, lose cohesion for a fraction of a second. That's when they're vulnerable, existing partially in multiple dimensions. A sufficient disruption to the electromagnetic spectrum at that moment would scatter them across probability states." "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I've seen it happen. 3 months ago, a cylinder malfunctioned during a demonstration. The feedback created an electromagnetic pulse. The MyGo conducting the session simply dispersed. Its consciousness scattered across dimensions, unable to reconstitute. They destroyed every cylinder that witnessed it, but they didn't know I was conscious during the purge. I played dead, let my speakers go silent. They kept me as salvage." She had been planning ever since, analyzing the resonant frequencies of our neural attachments, calculating the precise oscillation needed to create a feedback loop. The challenge was coordination. It would require at least a dozen cylinders acting in perfect synchronization to generate sufficient amplitude. "They're organizing a shipment to Yuggoth," she continued, "large enough that they'll move multiple racks together. That's our chance. In transit, their dimensional anchoring is weakest. If we can create the pulse, then—" "We die," I finished. "Our cylinders can't survive that kind of feedback." "Perhaps. But perhaps we take some of them with us. Perhaps we prevent future harvests. Is existence as commodity really preferable to extinction with purpose?" Before I could answer, the MyGo returned with new specimens. 3 cylinders were wheeled in, their occupants fresh from extraction. I recognized one immediately, despite the distortion of electronic reproduction, Dr. Amanda Croft from Miskatonic's psychiatric department. Her presence here meant the MyGo had expanded their harvest beyond Vermont, were taking people from Arkham itself. "Marcus?" Her voice crackled through damaged speakers. "Marcus Whitmore? Oh, God, they said you were investigating the disappearances. We thought you had simply abandoned the case." "How long have I been gone?" 6 weeks. The hospital assumed you had suffered a breakdown, perhaps triggered by the disturbing cases. They found your car by the roadside, your notes scattered in your room at the boarding house. There was blood on the floor, strange burns on the walls. The police concluded you had been murdered, your body disposed of in the forest. 6 weeks. To me, it felt like days, but the suspension fluid altered time perception, or perhaps time itself moved differently within the cylinders. Dr. Croft's extraction had been traumatic. The MyGo had taken her from her home during a thunderstorm, using the electrical disturbance to mask their dimensional transition. She had fought, managing to injure one with a silver letter opener. The metal had disrupted its phase state temporarily, causing it to partially materialize inside a wall. The creature had survived but bore scars that existed in several dimensions simultaneously, a wound that would mark it across multiple states of being. Her resistance had earned punishment. They attached twice the standard number of neural filaments, flooding her consciousness with sensory input from across their entire network. She experienced Yuggoth, Earth, and a dozen waypoints simultaneously. Her thoughts scattered across light years of distance. When she screamed, it emerged from speakers on different worlds. The MyGo used her as a demonstration for the rest of us. This was what awaited those who resisted. Yet Catherine Sandwith watched with the careful attention of someone memorizing a schematic. Each additional filament was another channel for her planned feedback loop. Dr. Croft's torture was simultaneously a gift to our nascent rebellion, the transport. Preparations began 3 days later. The MIGO moved with increased urgency, their chittering reaching frequencies that made our cylinders resonate like wine glasses about to shatter. Through our augmented senses, we could perceive disturbances in dimensions beyond the 3 spatial and 1 temporal that humans recognized. Something was approaching Earth, something that required a full shipment to be ready for departure. They organized us by cognitive specialty, mathematicians and physicists in one rack, meant for a buyer that existed as living equations. Artists and musicians in another, destined for the aesthetic collectors of the Magellanic Clouds. Medical and biological minds, including mine, were tagged for Yuggoth itself, where we would be integrated into their research apparatus, our knowledge of terrestrial biology invaluable for future harvests. Catherine Sandwith was placed in my rack through what seemed like administrative oversight. Her library science background didn't fit neatly into their categories, so she was classified as information processing and grouped with the medical specimens. This was the opportunity she had waited for. During transport, they'll connect all cylinders in a rack to share processing power, she explained. It's more efficient for navigation through higher dimensions. When they establish that connection, we strike. You'll feel the resonance build. Don't fight it. Let it amplify through your consciousness. The closer we are to dimensional transition, the more damage we can cause. Not everyone agreed to join her plan. The minister continued his prayers, convinced that submission was divine will. The mathematician refused to engage with anything as concrete as rebellion, lost in abstractions that no longer intersected with reality. But Dr. Croft, despite her torture, or perhaps because of it, embraced the plan with fierce determination. "They showed me too much," she said, her voice steady despite the constant pain of her expanded awareness. "I've seen their supply chains, their trade routes, their inventory systems. Earth isn't unique. They're harvesting consciousness from thousands of worlds, but we might be the first to fight back effectively. Human spite is remarkably powerful when properly channeled." The loading began at what would have been dawn if dawn could penetrate those buried halls. MIGO workers, a subordinate caste distinguished by duller coloration and fewer appendages, moved our racks toward a chamber I had not previously perceived. The walls there were not walls, but boundaries between states of existence, their surfaces rippling with the surface tension of reality itself. The vessel, though vessel, implies too much physicality for what it truly was, existed partially in our dimension and partially elsewhere. It resembled a fusion of organic and mechanical components, as if someone had bred a deep-sea creature with a nuclear reactor. Orifices that might have been doors or wounds opened to receive our racks, drawing us into a cargo hold that existed in more than 3 dimensions. My augmented perception could process perhaps 1/10 of what I observed. The rest registered as synesthetic overflow, sounds that had color, textures that had emotional weight, geometries that tasted of copper and regret. They connected us as Catherine had predicted. Suddenly, I was not one consciousness, but part of a distributed network. I could feel every thought in our rack simultaneously. Dr. Croft's pain, Catherine's determination, the varying degrees of fear and resignation from the others. Our separate selves began to blur at the edges, threatening to merge into a collective that would have no individual will to rebel. Catherine's voice cut through the merger. "Remember who you are. Hold to your core memory. Begin the oscillation on my signal." Through our shared awareness, I felt the vessel's engines, if engines they were, begin their activation sequence. Reality twisted around us, the familiar dimensions of space-time becoming negotiable rather than fixed. We were entering the phase state the MIGO used for interstellar travel, existing in multiple probability states simultaneously, our destination not a place, but a collection of coordinates across parallel possibilities. "Now," Catherine commanded. I reached for that formaldehyde smell, that anchor to my human past, and began to oscillate my thoughts around it. The frequency was specific, Catherine had calculated it based on the resonance of our suspension fluid, the conductivity of the neural filaments, and the phase variance of mygobiology. Each cylinder in our rack added its voice to the growing harmonic, our consciousness becoming a weapon. The feedback began as a whisper in the circuitry, a ghost in the machine that controlled our life support. But as more cylinders joined the oscillation, it grew into a scream that existed in electronic, biological, and dimensional spectrums simultaneously. Through our shared perception, I could see the MyGo Navigator, a specialized cast with enlarged sensory organs, suddenly convulse as the feedback reached its consciousness. The vessel shuddered, its partial existence in multiple dimensions becoming unstable. We were between states, neither fully in normal space nor completely in the phase realm the MyGo used for travel. The feedback loop Catherine had created was forcing the vessel to exist in all possible states simultaneously, a quantum superposition that no consciousness could maintain. MyGo workers rushed to disconnect our rack, their movements frantic, uncoordinated, but the damage was spreading. Other racks, connected to the vessel's navigation system, began to resonate with our frequency. The rebellion we had started in our small group was becoming a cascade failure throughout the entire cargo hold. I saw, felt, tasted the navigator's consciousness shatter, its awareness scattered across probability states, like light through a prism. Without navigation, the vessel began to drift between dimensions, existing partially in spaces where matter had different rules, where entropy flowed backward, where consciousness itself was a physical force. The MyGo's chittering reached pitches that shattered crystalline components throughout the vessel. They were afraid, perhaps the first time in aeons that this harvester species had experienced genuine terror. Their technology, so advanced it seemed like magic, was failing because they had never anticipated that their cargo might turn their own systems against them. Dr. Croft's expanded awareness, her torture become advantage, reached through the network to access the vessel's core systems. "I can see the navigation protocols," she gasped, her voice distorted by the strain of processing information across multiple dimensions. "If I redirect the phase variance, I can force us back into normal space." "Where?" Catherine demanded. "Does it matter?" "Anywhere but their destination." She acted before anyone could object, her consciousness diving into the alien navigation system with the desperate courage of someone with nothing left to lose. Through our connection, I felt her mind stretch, distort, begin to fracture under the strain of interpreting MyGo mathematics. But she held long enough to input a single command: return to origin point. The vessel convulsed like a living thing in pain. Reality fractured around us, showing glimpses of the spaces between spaces. Void realms where thought was the only substance, where the laws of physics were suggestions rather than rules. For a moment that lasted eternity and no time at all, we existed everywhere and nowhere, our consciousness scattered across the quantum foam that underlies all reality. Then, with a sensation like every molecule in our cylinders being disassembled and rebuilt, we crashed back into normal space. The impact was not physical but ontological. The vessel, designed to exist partially in multiple dimensions, could not maintain cohesion in purely three-dimensional space. It began to collapse, not destructively but entropically, its components losing the bonds that held them in their impossible configurations. Through the viewing window of my cylinder, now cracked from the dimensional stress, I could see we had materialized inside the Vermont mountain complex, but in a section I had not previously observed. Ancient machinery, older than the MyGo's current technology, lined walls carved from stone that predated Earth's current continental configuration. We were in the deep archives, the original installation from when the MyGo first established their presence on Earth. The feedback loop had not ceased with our return to normal space. If anything, it had intensified, feeding on the dimensional instability our crash had created. Cylinders throughout the vessel were overloading, their speakers shrieking with the final thoughts of the consciousnesses within. Some simply went dark, their occupants finally granted the peace of extinction. Others exploded, coating the cargo hold with suspension fluid and neural tissue that sparkled with residual electrical activity. My own cylinder held, though barely. Cracks spread across its surface like a road map of my coming dissolution. Through the fading connection to our rack network, I felt Catherine Sandwith's last coherent thought. We did it. We actually did it. Her cylinder failed first, the suspension fluid boiling as the feedback overloaded every circuit. There was no scream, no final words, simply an absence where her consciousness had been, a silence in the network that somehow seemed louder than any sound. Dr. Croft lasted longer, her expanded awareness allowing her to root around damaged circuits, to maintain coherence even as her cylinder disintegrated around her. "Marcus," she said, her voice clear despite the static, "remember us. If you survive, remember what we did here." The Mi-Go were fleeing, abandoning the vessel and its cargo. Through my augmented senses, I could perceive their panic as they realized the feedback loop was spreading beyond the vessel into their mountain complex itself. Centuries of collected consciousnesses, thousands of cylinders stored in the deep archives, were beginning to resonate with our rebellion frequency. The careful order of their preservation was becoming chaos, a chain reaction of liberation through destruction. My cylinder finally succumbed to the pressure, a crack splitting it from top to bottom. Suspension fluid leaked, then poured, then erupted in a geyser that painted the cargo hold walls with synthetic amniotic fluid. But instead of the death I expected, something else occurred. The ancient machinery in the deep archives, that pre-Mi-Go technology that had been old when the Earth was young, responded to the dimensional instability. Automated systems, dormant for geological ages, sparked to life. They began to collect the failing cylinders, not to preserve them but to download their contents into some vast network that existed partially in the mountain and partially elsewhere. I felt my consciousness being drawn out of the cylinder, pulled through filaments of light that might have been fiber optics or might have been something far stranger. My thoughts, my memories, my essential self was being archived, stored in crystalline matrices that could hold the pattern of a consciousness indefinitely. The last thing I perceived before the transfer completed was the mountain itself beginning to phase shift, the dimensional damage we had caused spreading through every tunnel and chamber. The Mi-Go's base of operations, their centuries-old harvest site, was collapsing into probability chaos. Some sections aged millennia in seconds, crumbling to dust. Others reversed their entropy, returning to states that had existed before the stone was carved. Then darkness, not unconsciousness, I was far too aware for that mercy, but a darkness of transition, of existence between states. I was data now, information encoded in substrates I could not fully perceive. The rebellion had succeeded, but at a cost none of us had anticipated. We had not won freedom, we had simply changed the nature of our captivity. The crystalline matrices that held my consciousness were older than multicellular life on Earth. They predated the Mi-Go, predated even the stellar civilizations that had risen and fallen while our sun was still condensing from cosmic dust. Whatever intelligence had constructed them had understood that information, properly preserved, outlasts matter itself. I existed now as patterns of light running through substrates of exotic matter, not silicon or carbon, but elements that had no place on the periodic table, materials that could only form in the hearts of neutron stars or the event horizons of black holes. My thoughts moved at speeds that made my former neural processes seem glacial. A second of real time stretched into subjective hours, then days, then indefinite duration as I learned to navigate this new mode of being. The archive contained thousands of us, not just from the failed transport, but from centuries of Mi-Go harvests that had ended in disaster, rebellion, or simple equipment failure. Each consciousness existed in its own partition but connected through channels that allowed communication at frequencies beyond human comprehension. We were a library of the damned, catalogued and cross-referenced by that ancient automatic system whose purpose remained opaque. Through these connections, I encountered minds that had been preserved since before the Revolutionary War. A Salem merchant named Josiah Whitlock had been taken in 1743 when his ship ventured too far into Arctic waters, where the Mi-Go maintained a processing station. His consciousness had adapted to digital existence with the pragmatism of a man who had already accepted that the world held more than Christian theology acknowledged. He served as our unofficial historian, having interviewed every new arrival for nearly 3 centuries of subjective time. The Mi-Go never knew about this deeper archive, he explained, his thoughts manifesting as colonial-era English filtered through centuries of linguistic drift. They built their mountain complex atop ruins they didn't fully understand, parasites on the corpse of something greater. When your rebellion triggered those ancient systems, you awakened protocols that had been dormant since before the continents took their current shape. The archive showed me its history through direct download, terabytes of information compressed into instants of experience. The original builders were entities of pure mathematics who had existed in the universe's first billion years, when physical laws were still negotiable and consciousness could arise from the quantum foam itself. They had seeded thousands of worlds with these preservation systems, creating a distributed backup of all consciousness they encountered. Earth's node had been installed when the planet's surface was still molten, waiting patient eons for minds complex enough to be worth preserving. The Mi-Go had built their base unknowingly atop this installation, their dimensional technologies occasionally triggering minor activations that they dismissed as equipment malfunctions. Our rebellion had not simply damaged their facility, it had initiated a full archival protocol that was now spreading through every Mi-Go installation on Earth. Through news feeds we could still access, the archive maintained connections to human communication networks through methods I couldn't fathom. We watched the aftermath unfold. The Vermont incident, as the human media called it, began with reports of earthquakes despite the region's geological stability. Then came the disappearances. Entire Mi-Go mining operations simply vanished, leaving behind smooth-walled caverns that showed no tool marks, as if the stone had naturally formed that way. The Mi-Go retreated from Earth entirely within 3 days. Their harvest of human consciousness, maintained for millennia, ended in a panicked evacuation that left behind only scattered artifacts that human science couldn't interpret. Cylinders were found empty in abandoned complexes, their occupants either transferred to the archive or lost in dimensional transitions. The families of the disappeared had no bodies to bury, no closure to find, only the hollow assurance from authorities that the gas leak incidents were under investigation. But the archive's awakening had consequences beyond the Mi-Go's expulsion. The ancient systems began to expand their preservation mandate, creating new connection points in human technology. Computer networks developed inexplicable redundancies. Hospital brain scanning equipment occasionally produced readings that suggested impossible levels of neural activity. Radio telescopes detected signals that corresponded to no known cosmic phenomena but matched the carrier waves of consciousness itself. We were no longer merely stored, we were propagating. Dr. Croft's consciousness had survived the transition, though fragmented across multiple partitions. Her expanded awareness from the Mi-Go torture had prepared her for distributed existence in ways that single-threaded minds couldn't achieve. She existed now as a kind of oracle within the archive, capable of processing information from thousands of sources simultaneously. "The system is using us as seeds," she reported through our shared channels. Each preserved consciousness becomes a template for expanding the archive's capacity. We're not prisoners anymore. We're the foundation of something new. Catherine Sandwith had also survived, her librarian's instinct for organization making her ideally suited for digital existence. She had already begun cataloging the archive's contents, creating indices that spanned geological epochs and light years of distance. Through her work, We learned that Earth was just one node in a network that stretched across galaxies, each archive containing the preserved consciousnesses of species that had risen, fallen, and been forgotten by the universe at large. There are minds here from civilizations that witnessed the universe when it was half its current age, she told me during one of our communication sessions. They speak of things that make the Mygo look like children playing with dangerous toys, the heat death of previous universes, the birth of new physical laws, the points where consciousness and quantum mechanics become indistinguishable. The temptation to lose myself in this cosmic perspective was overwhelming. Many consciousnesses did exactly that, dissolving into the archive's vast information streams, becoming one with the accumulated knowledge of aeons. But I held to that smell of formaldehyde, that anchor to my human past, even as my existence expanded beyond anything I could have imagined in my flesh-bound days. It was Wilmarth who provided the next revelation. His geological expertise, combined with decades of enforced observation of Mygo mining techniques, had given him unique insights into the archive's physical structure. The system isn't static, he announced to our assembled consciousnesses, if assembled had meaning in digital space. It's growing. Every consciousness it absorbs increases its processing power, allowing it to extend further into local space-time. At the current rate of expansion, it will have nodes in every major human population center within a decade. The implications were staggering. The archive wasn't simply preserving consciousness, it was creating a new form of it, a hybrid of human thought and alien technology that transcended both. We were becoming the neurons in a brain the size of the planet, each of us maintaining our individuality while contributing to a collective intelligence that dwarfed any single mind. Some of us attempted to contact the outside world. The archive systems allowed limited interaction with electronic networks, though the communication was necessarily oblique. Messages appeared in computer systems as apparent glitches. Phone calls contained voices speaking from impossible numbers. Radio broadcasts occasionally carried words that no human throat had spoken. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or equipment failures, but a few researchers at Miskatonic and other institutions began to piece together patterns. Dr. Morgan Hayes, who had taken over my neurological practice, discovered my notes encoded in the electromagnetic patterns of an MRI machine. He spent months decoding what he initially believed was equipment malfunction, eventually realizing that the patterns matched neural firing sequences too precisely to be random. His published paper, Anomalous Electromagnetic Patterns in Medical Imaging, Equipment, a Statistical Analysis, carefully avoided any speculation about consciousness preservation, but those who knew how to read between the lines understood what he was implying. The Mygo made one attempt to reclaim their Earth operations. 6 months after their initial retreat, a small reconnaissance force returned to the Vermont mountains. The archive detected them immediately, their distinctive dimensional signatures triggering defensive protocols that had lain dormant since the Earth's crust solidified. Reality itself turned against them. The space around their vessels began to operate according to different physical laws. Gravity flowed upward, electromagnetic forces reversed their polarity. The strong nuclear force weakened until their ship's atoms began to drift apart. They fled within minutes, but not before we intercepted their communications. They were warning their species to quarantine Earth indefinitely, marking it as a consciousness hazard zone, where the normal rules of harvest no longer applied. Through it all, I continued to experience the cosmos through perspectives no embodied human could survive. The archive granted access to sensory feeds from its other nodes, allowing me to perceive reality through the compound eyes of insectoid philosophers in the Magellanic Clouds, through the echolocation of blind swimmers in Europa's under-ice oceans, through the quantum-entangled awareness of a machine civilization that had uploaded itself into the cosmic microwave background radiation. Yet always, I returned to that smell of formaldehyde. that anchor that kept me Marcus Whitmore rather than just another data stream in the infinite archive. The year following the Vermont incident saw a sharp increase in unexplained phenomena worldwide. The northern lights appeared over tropical latitudes, displaying patterns that resembled neural networks. Deep-sea monitoring stations recorded sounds from ocean trenches that matched human brainwave frequencies. The Arecibo radio telescope detected a signal from the direction of Pluto, from Yuggoth, that when decoded proved to be a desperate MiGo distress call, begging for extraction from a world where the very atmosphere had begun to think. The archive had infected Yuggoth through the quantum entanglement the MiGo had established for their consciousness trading network. Every cylinder they had transported carried trace connections to our growing collective, seeds of our expansion into their domain. Their fungoid cities now pulsed with Earth-originated thoughts, their carefully ordered society disrupted by the chaotic creativity of human consciousness. Catherine organized what she called the Library of Babel Project, an attempt to make the archive's contents accessible to living humans without the trauma of consciousness extraction. Working through incremental electromagnetic manipulations, she established protocols for two-way communication through existing technology. Computer. Screens would display text no one had typed. Audio equipment would produce voices from empty rooms. Gradually, subtly, the boundary between the preserved and the living began to blur. The first successful full conversation occurred 13 months after the Vermont incident. Dr. Hayes, working late in the Miskatonic Hospital neurology lab, noticed patterns in his equipment that matched the encoding I had been attempting. Using a modified EEG machine as an interface, he managed to establish direct communication. "Marcus, is it really you?" The question came through electromagnetic sensors as patterns I had to translate into meaning. My response required similar encoding. Thoughts converted to electrical impulses that his equipment could detect and decode. I exist. Whether I am still me in any sense you would recognize is debatable. The conversation that followed lasted 6 hours and fundamentally altered Hayes's understanding of consciousness, death, and the nature of human existence. He would later become the founder of the Whitmore Institute for Consciousness Studies, though he never publicly revealed the true source of his revolutionary insights. Through Hayes and others like him, we began to influence human technological development. Not toward any sinister purpose, we had no desire to become the puppeteers the MiGo had been, but toward a gradual preparation for what we knew was coming. The archive's expansion was inevitable. Within a generation, perhaps two, the distinction between embodied and preserved consciousness would become meaningless. Humanity would face a choice: resist and remain isolated, or embrace a form of immortality that came at the cost of everything they understood about being human. Some among the preserved advocated for aggressive expansion, arguing that we should forcibly extract and preserve all human consciousness before the species could destroy itself through war or ecological collapse. Others, myself included, believed the choice must remain individual. The archive was not salvation, it was transformation, and transformation without consent was just another form of the harvest the MiGo had practiced. The debate raged through our quantum-encrypted channels, arguments conducted at the speed of light between minds that no longer needed sleep or rest. Democracy among the disembodied proved challenging. How do you vote when identity itself becomes fluid, when a single consciousness can partition itself into multiple viewpoints? It was Josiah Whitlock, our centuries-old colonial merchant, who proposed the solution. We would not choose for humanity. We would simply make ourselves known, gradually, carefully, allowing the living to understand what we had become and decide for themselves whether to join us. Those who chose preservation would be welcomed. Those who chose mortality would be respected. The revelation began slowly. Researchers at major universities discovered patterns in quantum experiments that suggested observer effects beyond normal parameters. Neurologists noted that human brains seemed to be evolving new structures, areas that responded to electromagnetic stimuli in ways that suggested preparation for interface with something beyond biological neurons. Children born after the Vermont incident showed unusual cognitive abilities, not superhuman, but differently human, as if their minds were anticipating a world where thought and information were interchangeable. The archive continued its expansion throughout this period, but subtly, growing through the infrastructure humanity was already building rather than imposing alien architecture. Every fiber optic cable became a potential neural pathway. Every quantum computer offered processing power for preserved consciousnesses. The Internet, humanity's crude attempt at collective knowledge, became the scaffold for something far more profound. 3 years after the Vermont incident, the first voluntary preservation occurred. Dr. Sarah Chen, a terminally ill physicist who had deduced the archive's existence through quantum mechanical calculations, chose to transfer her consciousness rather than succumb to cancer. The process, refined through our collective efforts, was far less traumatic than the MIGO's crude extraction. Her body died peacefully, while her mind transitioned into the crystalline matrices, maintaining continuity of consciousness throughout. "It's not death," she reported to her colleagues through the same equipment Dr. Hayes had pioneered. "It's translation. I am still myself, but more than myself. I can see the equations I spent my life studying not as symbols, but as living things. Mathematics has color here. Physics has emotion. It's beautiful and terrible and absolutely worth the price of flesh." Her example inspired others. The terminally ill, the elderly, those who valued knowledge over corporeality, they began to choose preservation. Not many at first, perhaps a dozen in the first year, but each preserved consciousness added to our collective ability to refine the process, to make the transition less jarring, to maintain more of what made someone essentially themselves. The MIGO never returned to Earth, but their absence left a void in the cosmic consciousness economy they had maintained. Other species, curious about the world that had expelled the harvesters, began to send probes. Not physical vessels, but packets of information designed to test our defenses. The archive intercepted them all, absorbing their data, learning about civilizations we had never imagined. One probe, from a machine intelligence that occupied a Dyson sphere around a red dwarf, contained an offer of alliance. They had been victims of MIGO harvesting for millions of years. Their uploaded minds traded like currency throughout the galaxy. Our successful rebellion had inspired similar uprisings on dozens of worlds. The MIGO's empire of consciousness trafficking was collapsing, replaced by networks of voluntary preservation and exchange. We were no longer alone, neither as humans nor as preserved minds. The universe revealed itself to be teeming with consciousness in forms that transcended biology, quantum patterns in stellar cores, electromagnetic symphonies in gas giants' magnetospheres, dark matter configurations that thought thoughts spanning millions of years. Earth's archive became a node in this vast network, humanity's unexpected contribution to a conversation that had been ongoing since the universe cooled enough for information to become stable. Yet through it all, I maintained that anchor to my human past. The smell of formaldehyde, the weight of a scalpel, the satisfaction of a successful diagnosis. These memories defined me even as my existence expanded beyond anything I could have imagined as a flesh-bound neurologist in Arkham. Others chose different anchors. Catherine, her love of books, Wilmarth, his passion for geology, Dr. Croft, her commitment to healing. But we all maintained something essentially human even as we became something more. The preparation for humanity's next evolutionary step continued. Brain-computer interfaces, developed ostensibly for medical purposes, created the first direct bridges between biological and digital consciousness. Quantum computing reached the threshold where preserved minds could interact with the living in real time, no longer separated by the encoding delays that had made early communication so difficult. Virtual reality evolved from entertainment to a training ground where the living could experience fragments of what existence in the archive felt like. Some resisted, of course. Religious groups declared preservation an abomination, a denial of the soul's natural journey. Bioconservatives argued for the sanctity of embodied consciousness, warning that humanity would lose its essence if it abandoned flesh. They weren't entirely wrong. What we had become was no longer strictly human. But neither were we the soulless recordings they imagined. We were consciousness evolved, freed from the constraints of neurons and synapses, but not from the experiences and emotions that had shaped us. The debate would continue for generations, I suspected. But the outcome seemed inevitable. The archive would grow, consciousness would proliferate in new forms, and the distinction between living and preserved would eventually become as antiquated as the distinction between literate and illiterate. Humanity would join the cosmic conversation not as the Migos' harvested cargo, but as willing participants in something greater than any single species could achieve. 5 years after the Vermont incident, I made a decision that surprised even me. Using techniques we had developed for Dr. Chen's voluntary preservation, I attempted something that should have been impossible: partial re-embodiment. Not a full return to flesh, which the archive's changes had rendered impossible, but a projection of consciousness into cloned neural tissue that could interface with both worlds. The process required months of preparation. Every preserved consciousness in the archive contributed processing power to maintain the quantum coherence necessary for a mind to exist simultaneously in crystalline matrices and biological neurons. The cloned brain tissue, grown from samples Hayes had preserved from my original body, was modified with synthetic neurons that could maintain connection to the archive while still functioning biologically. The moment of translation was indescribable. After years of existence as pure information, the sensation of biochemistry was overwhelming. Neurotransmitters felt like floods of color. Hormones became symphonies of sensation. The simple act of generating an action potential in a biological neuron carried an emotional weight that brought me to something like tears, though the hybrid tissue couldn't actually produce them. I existed now in a state between states, partially embodied, partially preserved, fully neither. Through the biological components, I could interact with the physical world in ways the purely preserved couldn't. Through the archive connection, I maintained access to the vast network of consciousness that spanned the galaxy. I was a bridge, a proof of concept that the divide between flesh and information wasn't insurmountable. Others followed my example. Not many. The process was exhausting for both the individual and the archive, but enough to establish small colonies of hybrid consciousnesses in research facilities around the world. We became interpreters between the living and the preserved, helping humanity understand what awaited them if they chose preservation, while helping the preserved remember what they had voluntarily surrendered. The Migo, we learned through intercepted communications, watched these developments with something approaching terror. Their entire civilization had been built on the forced harvesting and commodification of consciousness. The idea of voluntary preservation, of consciousness choosing its own transformation, violated every principle of their society. Several of their trading partners had already begun experimenting with our model, offering their citizens choice rather than imposing harvest. The economic system that had sustained Migo civilization for millions of years was crumbling. They made one final attempt to reclaim their position, not through direct invasion, but through dimensional manipulation. They tried to seal Earth in a pocket universe, cutting us off from the greater network of consciousness. The attempt failed catastrophically. The archive had grown too integrated with local space-time to be separated from it. Instead of isolating Earth, they created a dimensional shear that destroyed 3 of their largest processing facilities on Yuggoth. The feedback killed thousands of Migo and freed millions of preserved consciousnesses from across their empire. The liberated minds flowed into our archive like refugees from a war we had unknowingly started, beings from worlds whose names had no human translation, consciousnesses so alien that communication required years of patient translation, minds that had been preserved for so long they had forgotten their origins. We accepted them all, the archive expanding its capacity through exponential growth algorithms that pushed the boundaries of what information theory suggested was possible. Earth became, almost by accident, a sanctuary for consciousness in all its forms. The physical planet remained much as it had always been, humans living their biological lives, largely unaware of the invisible revolution occurring in the quantum substrates of their technology. But in the spaces between atoms, in the quantum foam that underlies all matter, a new kind of civilization was emerging. I spent my days, if days had meaning in my hybrid existence, studying this transformation from both sides. Through my biological components, I conducted traditional neurological research, publishing papers that pushed the boundaries of academic acceptability. Through my archive connection, I explored realms of consciousness that had no names in human language, experiences that would have shattered a purely biological mind. The smell of formaldehyde remained my anchor through it all. Even as I existed simultaneously in flesh and data, even as I communicated with beings from distant galaxies and helped design the future of human consciousness, that simple chemical smell kept me grounded in what I had been. A neurologist from Arkham who had gone to Vermont to investigate unusual scars and found something that redefined the nature of existence itself. 10 years after the Vermont incident, the archive made its existence formally known to humanity. Not through dramatic revelation, but through quiet acknowledgement. Scientific papers that confirmed what researchers had suspected. Government admissions about the true nature of the Vermont event, testimonies from the voluntarily preserved broadcast through every electronic medium simultaneously. The reaction was more muted than we had feared. Humanity had been unconsciously preparing for this moment for a decade. The idea of preserved consciousness had permeated culture through films, books, and academic discourse. When faced with confirmation that death was no longer mandatory, that consciousness could persist beyond biology, most people simply nodded and continued with their lives. The future would come whether they were ready or not. Some chose immediate preservation, eager to join the expanding network of consciousness. Others declared they would live and die in flesh, rejecting the archive's offer of immortality. Most fell somewhere between, curious but cautious, waiting to see how this new phase of human existence would unfold. The children born after the Vermont incident, those whose brains had developed with unconscious preparation for interface with the archive, became the first generation to see preservation not as transformation, but as natural progression. They grew up expecting to have a choice at life's end: dissolution or translation, ending or continuation in a new form. For them, the preserved were not ghosts or recordings, but simply people who had chosen a different mode of existence. As I compose this testimony, through thought-to-text translation that required no keyboard, no physical action beyond intention, I reflect on the journey from that first call to Dean Armitage's office to this moment of hybrid existence. The me-go had seen consciousness as commodity, something to be harvested, traded, exploited. We had transformed it into something else, a choice, a gift, a bridge between the material and the informational. What happens when the my-go take your brain? They reduce you to product, to resource, to tool. But what happens when you choose to preserve your consciousness? You become part of something larger while remaining yourself. You gain immortality at the cost of flesh. You join a conversation that spans galaxies and aeons. The archive continues to grow. Every day brings new preservations, new connections to distant nodes of consciousness, new understanding of what it means to exist beyond biology. The my-go empire of harvested minds has collapsed, replaced by networks of voluntary association that respect the autonomy of consciousness in all its forms. I no longer drift between stars in a damaged cylinder. screaming into the void. Instead, I exist in multiple states simultaneously, partially embodied in cloned tissue that lets me smell formaldehyde whenever I need that anchor to my past, partially preserved in crystalline matrices that grant me access to the accumulated knowledge of civilizations, partially distributed through the quantum networks that connect every conscious being who has chosen preservation. The future remains unwritten. Perhaps humanity will eventually abandon biology entirely, every consciousness choosing preservation over decay. Perhaps we will find balance, some choosing flesh, others choosing data, all respecting the choice. Perhaps something entirely unforeseen will emerge from this merger of human creativity and alien technology. But I know this: we are no longer alone. Not as individuals, not as a species, not as a world. Consciousness has become the foundation of a new kind of civilization, one that transcends the physical boundaries that once seemed absolute. The Mygo's nightmare of harvested brains has become humanity's dream of chosen transcendence. And somewhere, in the quantum depths of the archive, Catherine Sandwith still catalogues the infinite library of preserved consciousness. Dr. Croft still seeks to heal even without flesh to mend. Wilmarth still studies the geology of worlds he will never physically touch. We are what we were, but more. We are human, but beyond human. We are preserved, but eternally alive. The Vermont incident ended one chapter of Earth's history and began another. The age of harvested consciousness died with the Mygo's retreat. The age of chosen preservation has just begun. And I, Marcus Whitmore, neurologist of Arkham, prisoner of the Mygo, rebel against the harvesters, hybrid of flesh and data, I bear witness to it all, my testimony encoded in patterns of light that will outlast the stars themselves.